Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us this morning for the first session of our two-part webinar series, An Integrated Approach to Strategic Pension Liability Management. This is presented by the California Debt and Investment Advisory Commission. I am Robert Berry. I'm the Executive Director here at CDIAC. The financial condition and service level solvency of all your agency is so strongly linked to the financial health of your pension plans. And without a commitment to sustained cost and liability management, your agency can become very financially vulnerable during inevitable economic cycles. I think most of, if not all of you attending this program today understand this and know that staying on top of the pension liability mountain, or at least maintaining a solid footing in climbing it, requires a sustained and strategic pension management approach. But what liability management strategies exist? How are they affected by market conditions? And can strategies be integrated to create a policy-driven approach that is more resilient to changing economic conditions, actuarial assumptions, and underlying plan policies? These are the questions that this webinar series is designed to address. So during today's session, our presenters will begin by exploring the pension challenge, how it's viewed by different analysts of municipal financial condition. Then there will be a review of some pension fundamentals, including why pension costs continue to trend higher. And then finally, the program today will begin the exploration of the key pension management strategies. Then next Thursday on the 31st, the program will pick up in our second session with more on the management strategies, more detail, followed by an exploration of the considerations for establishing pension funding policies. Then we will hear from three public finance executives from three very different agencies about how they approach their pension liability challenges, the strategies that they use, and the results they achieved. Our presenters today have put in a lot of hours to put together some really terrific content. But before I introduce our presenters and we get started, just a few brief announcements that may be helpful to you, especially if you're not used to this platform. First, the slides. All of the slides are available in two places. First, you can open the handouts section of your GoToWebinar control panel, and there you'll find a link to the slides. Or at any time, you can find them linked to CDIAC's webpage on the left column under our education highlights. You'll find a link to the program there. Questions. Use your questions box, and that's in the control panel as well, to submit questions anytime during the program. We'll have opportunities during the program to address questions, and then we'll have a few minutes for a Q&A session at the end of the program. Captioning. If you need live captioning, we have a great captioning service that's accessible through the linked address in the chat section of the control panel. You'll see that listed there. Certificates of attendance. If you need a certificate of attendance as a proof of your participation, within about 2 weeks of the initial airing, we'll send out certificates of participation to those who participated in 70% of the webinar. As far as replays go, we'll make a full replay of both sessions available in CDIAC's education portal about 2 weeks after the second session concludes. The education portal is CDIAC's learning management system, if you're not familiar with it, and it's linked to the front page of CDIAC's website if you need to go back there. When the replay is ready, we'll send an email, a direct link to the series in an email to everyone who's registered. If you have any technical problems, the platform can provide some assistance at the number and link on the screen, but I think usually what works best if you're having technical problems is to leave the webinar and log back in again. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our faculty presenters for this session, Management Strategies to Meet the Resurging Pension Challenge. First, I'm pleased to introduce Mike Meyer. Mike is a vice president at NHA Advisors and has been serving California local agencies for 2 decades, both as an underwriter at De La Rosa and the last 12 years as a municipal advisor at NHA. In addition to managing many municipal bond transactions, the reason I sought Mike out for this program is Mike manages NHA's Pension and Fiscal Sustainability Consulting Group, which has served approximately 100 CalPERS and non-CalPERS members since its inception. As the fiduciary, Mike and his team help agencies to evaluate the benefits and risks of pension cost management strategies tailored to their unique needs and circumstances, with the goal of achieving long-term fiscal sustainability. These are the same management strategies that he will be exploring with you today and next week in this series. And then joining Mike this morning is Todd Towser. Todd is a senior vice president and actuary with Siegel. He specializes in public pension funding, risk management, and plan sustainability as Siegel's national public sector retirement practice leader. Todd works primarily with major city and county retirement systems throughout the state of California and with Nevada PERS. Prior to Siegel, Todd was the director of municipal pensions at S&P Global Ratings. At S&P, he helped develop a detailed risk framework to evaluate the health and sustainability of public pension and OPEB plans across the country. Before S&P, Todd was also a senior pension actuary at CalPERS, where he was heavily involved in the asset liability management and risk mitigation. Todd serves in various national actuarial leadership roles, has provided leadership on pensions to the state legislature and auditor's office, and he's also on GFOA's Committee on Retirement and Benefits Administration, if you're familiar with that committee. And Todd's also collaborated numerous times with CDIAC on pension education. So thank you both very much for being with us here today. Todd, you are leading off. I'll pass it to you.
All right, thank you, Robert, and good morning, everyone. It's good to be here. As Robert said, that the title of this webinar is an integrated approach to strategic pension liability management, and that is really near and dear to my heart. I've focused my career on, and Robert talked extensively already well enough about what my background is, but one point to make is that a lot of pension actuaries, when they get their fellowship in the Society of Actuaries, become a pension actuary, they get their fellowship in a track called pension, the pension track. I actually did not do that. I took a separate track from my peers. I took the track that's called ERM, Enterprise Risk Management. And then I turned that into a focus and a career-long pursuit, if you will, on pensions. So applying enterprise risk management and strategies to pension plans. So that's really the focus that I have today. All right, looks like I have control of the slides. Thank you. And so really we're going to start off, Robert gave a great introduction. I'm going to give a quick background on pension basics and the landscape here in California. Cover a little bit about the actuarial valuation and how liabilities are determined. We won't spend too long on that. How unfunded liabilities are paid off, because that helps us understand how contributions are set. And then swing around and talk about pension plans in California generally, how we've gotten to where we are today, and then I'll pass it on to Mike to tee up the pension risk management strategies that we'll cover in a lot more detail in part 2. So we're starting right here with part 1, which is management strategies to meet the resurging pension challenge. And we thought, as a bit of an introduction to why we're paying attention to this topic, we give some additional perspectives on pensions and what we're calling as the pension challenge. We give a couple different viewpoints here. So this first one is NHA gathered information on about 100 cities here in California, and they have a range of credit ratings. I think the average, it says here on the slide, the average is AA. And they looked at some of the categories that S&P uses to rank these cities. And you can see pension and debt or total liabilities here is the worst by far. It's down right at the weak level on average for these plans. Whereas, sorry, for these plan sponsors is what I should be saying, for these employers. It's right down at the weak level. For all these other ratings, you can see that they're all above adequate, and really on average, they average about strong for budgetary flexibility, performance, management, and economy. So there really is a perspective here that there's a particular and unique challenge when it comes to pension and overall debt and liability management. So again, we're giving an idea here of why we care and why we're paying so much attention to this today, even though it may not need to be told to our audience, because I'm sure you're very familiar with why we care about this pension challenge. Here's another slide from S&P, and this is just to further to drive home the point here that S&P, this is directly from an S&P publication. It's their quick start guide to S&P Global Ratings approach to U.S. state and local government pensions. And they list the 5 primary rating factors here. You got institutional governmental framework, the laws that govern the pension plan, along with the employers. You've got the economy, both demographic and economic. You've got finances, whether you're looking at budget, reserves, etc. You've got the management team, management policies, and how that all fits together. And then you finally got debt and liabilities, which is, of course, the heart of where pensions lie. And you can see they've circled all the areas that pensions, whether healthy or unhealthy pensions, can affect the ratings. And it's 4 out of the 5 primary rating factors here. And then you get to an anchor rating, and then they have what they call caps, notches, and holistic analysis, the overrides there at the end. And then they've circled that as well. Pensions can affect that. So not only can it affect 4 out of the 5 main categories of ratings, but then you get to the overrides and adjustments, and whether you have a strong or weak pension, it can filter through to the final overrides and changes as well. So really a holistic approach to analyzing pensions and fitting it into the risk profile, if you will, and the budgetary profile of municipalities. The final slide I have here on S&P, nope, I double clicked, there we go, is that not only does S&P, and really I'm using S&P as a proxy because I'm most familiar with it, but it's really all credit rating agencies. You look at Moody's, you look at Fitch, they've also started to focus a lot more on these topics over time related to pensions. And so not only here is there a greater focus in general, but they've also adjusted the way that pensions have been analyzed over time. So there's been an evolution in how they look at pension plans. And I'm a testament to that myself. As Robert mentioned, I was hired at S&P as Director of Municipal Pensions. Before I was hired into that position, it didn't exist. They had created that position out of thin air. They hired 2 of us into that position, and then the point of that was because they wanted to have a better understanding of pension plans and pension trajectory over time. What decisions have been made in the past? What have that led to today for pension plans and the plan sponsors, the employers? And then what decisions are being made today, and what would that lead to in the future in terms of plan health, in terms of affordability? So they wanted to have a more comprehensive view, and that's why they created my position, and they've really adjusted their focus towards that over time. So you can see on the picture, in the past, credit rating agencies might have just focused on today's cost. What are they paying into the pension plan without understanding whether it was a good amount going in, whether it was effective at dealing with unfunded liabilities or not. And that's really changed over time for credit rating agencies. Now they start with those costs today, and then they look at, well, what are the underlying assumptions that the pension plan is using to value those liabilities? What are the key methods and funding practices to set the contribution rate and to deal with those liabilities over time? Will it lead to increased contributions and decreased funded status over time, or will it lead to a more healthy pension plan over time? So what will it lead to in terms of future costs? And then, of course, they're going to tie that into the credit rating picture, so they're going to tie it into whether there's budgetary stress or not. So I think this really long-term view, more comprehensive view, is very relevant to our discussion today as we talk about pension management strategies. So I think it's an important point to kind of hammer home. Now, another perspective besides the credit rating agencies themselves, but definitely related, is this is from a survey that was done of bond investors. So this was a PNC municipal bond analyst survey. You can see it's a little bit old. It's March of 2018. I don't think the perspective has changed very much in the last 4 to 5 years. So I think it's still quite relevant today. And this was right as I was leaving S&P, I saw this survey. It really stuck with me because it shocked me. What they did was they asked a whole bunch of municipal bond analysts. They said, what is your biggest concern? What are the most important issues facing the municipal bond market? Basically, what keeps you up at night as you're trying to do your job? And you know, they could fill out multiple ones, they could select multiple ones, so these don't add up to 100. But the point of this slide is that public pensions ranked #1 across the concerns. The funding levels, the risks associated with pension obligation bonds, you name it, public pensions are here at 90% at #1. And this is in comparison to other very important topics. If you look down the list, you've got health reform, immigration reform, infrastructure spending, etc. Those did not rank as highly in this list as public pensions. So another perspective here that I think really hammers home the point of why we're paying such attention to this topic even today. And then finally, one last perspective. Now, the California State Auditor put together a task force. They called it the High Risk Advisory Team for Local Governments. I had the honor of being on this task force as it was put together, and put together kind of the metrics that we were going to use to analyze local governments. So that was a really interesting process. And this is a dashboard that they use. It's the Fiscal Distress Risk Monitor. And so here we're teasing out different ways to analyze key risk, and you put it on a simple scale. You can see the colors from low risk to high risk. And so you can see, you just look at whatever's listed at high risk here. Future pension cost risk is the highest out of the things we've listed here. The only one here in the red, we've got pension current costs and pension obligation risks, and you think of that as the liabilities themselves. Also in the moderate risk category, but on the high end. So very clear case here for what is viewed as some of the more risky and more things that this group at least chose to focus on based on their analysis. So 3 different perspectives here on why we're paying attention to this today, just as way of kind of a background and a setup to what we're going to talk about. And with that, I'm going to dive right in. We'll start with some basics, but we won't stay on them too long. So first, we're starting with the California pension landscape. Here, I think it's worth pointing out in California, everyone knows CalPERS, huge plan, hundreds of billions of dollars in assets. CalSTRS, another huge plan, hundreds of billions of dollars in assets. You look at the entire nation, CalPERS and CalSTRS are #1 and #2 in size. There's no other state that has a larger pension plan than either one of those two. So they kind of overshadow what's going on in California, but there are a lot of other systems, a lot of other pension plans in California, and that's worth reminding ourselves. There's the UCRP, the UC Retirement Program. That covers all UC campuses, all staff within UC campuses. That's a very large pension system statewide. There's 20 county plans within California. In 1937, there was a law that was passed that allowed counties to establish their own pension system outside of CalPERS, and 20 counties did that. So we call them the 1937 Act county plans, because that's when they established those plans and were independent from CalPERS. Working for Siegel, I work on over half of those plans, over 10 of them. So I'm very involved in the county plans here in California. And then there's a whole bunch of city plans. There's LA has 3 plans. LA General Employees, LA Fire and Police Employees, LA DWP, Department of Water and Power has their own plan. San Francisco, San Diego, etc. So there's a lot of plans out there. And then there's some smaller plans that are transit districts, municipal utilities, etc. So we have a lot here. In fact, I would say if you look at California compared to an average nation in Europe, we actually have more pension plans and more pension assets than most other nations. So it really is a very interesting place to work in pensions. And helpful to understand that we have such a broad environment that we're operating within. As far as the pension benefits themselves, this is taken straight from CalPERS. A quick review, just a reminder, how do we determine what a pension benefit is in retirement? Well, there's 3 factors. We take service credit, the amount of years that you've worked for your employer, that's within CalPERS. Then there's the benefit factor employed. You can see examples down there, like general 2% at 55, safety 3% at 50. Those often, especially on the general side, will adjust depending on your years of service, or sorry, your age at retirement, I should say. So if you retire earlier than 55, your benefit factor should be less than 2. If you're retiring later than 55, your benefit factor will be greater than 2. And then finally, you look at your final average compensation. And for older employees under different benefit formulas, that's 1 year. You just look at your last year of final compensation if it's your highest year. And then for newer employers, we look at 3 years. So a 36-month consecutive average. So a little bit more smoothing in the final average compensation, but the exact same idea. So what does this all mean? If I work at CalPERS for 20 years, I have 20 years of service credit, and I'm a general employee and retire at 55 using the example on the slide, I get a 2% multiplier. So I take my 20 years and multiply it by 2%, and I get 40%. And then I look at my final compensation, and let's say that's $100,000. And so I multiply 40% by $100,000, and I get $40,000 a year in retirement all the way until I pass away. And there's some nuances about providing the beneficiaries and all that. We won't cover that today, but that is the idea behind the pension promise that we see here in California. And that's pretty uniform. My example here is CalPERS, but you look at the county plans, you look at the city plans, it's all very, very similar in how your benefit is calculated. In fact, I have an example here from one of the county plans. I won't go through the formula again, but it's the very same idea as what I just talked about. But in this slide, I think it's also worth pointing out, as I kind of did in the last slide, that there are also different employee classifications, different categories of employees. And those different employee classifications may have a different benefit structure. So you can have general employees, you can have safety employees, you can have other categories. You can have CHP, which is a California CalPERS classification of employees. You can have firefighters versus police. You can have lifeguards having their own plans. So there's a lot of different kinds of classes that you can get, and you can establish whatever benefit formula is allowed based on those classes. In addition to that, you can see we have tier 1 here and tier 2. So this is a nod to the fact that here in California, we had a really big change in our pension benefits back in 2013, and that was called PEPRA. It's the California Public Employees Pension Reform Act. That's where PEPRA comes from. And so when 2013 hit, it was decided basically by the legislature that the benefit levels were a little bit too generous and the costs were a bit too high. And so there was a reform put in with new tiers with lower levels of benefits and generally higher age for retirement. It's not just the benefit itself, it's the age that was looked at. And so those members who are employed before 2013, we call them classic members, and they're under the old formula. It's still, they don't change. They get what was promised them on hire. And so they still have the old formulas, but anyone hired after 2013 is a new member that goes into the PEPRA tiers with the lower formula. So we do have a division there by this pension reform. And so I think that's illustrated nicely on this slide with the different tiers. Now, continuing in this review, we're going to start moving away from how we determine benefits and what we're giving to our employees and start talking about how those benefits are actually funded, how we pay for those benefits. And so this slide, I think, is a good illustration of the 3 ways that we fund the money. The first 2 are probably pretty obvious. Well, we need contributions. Those contributions come in from the employers participating in the plan, along with the employees. And the third one is then we take those contributions from the employers and the employees and we invest them. We want it to accumulate and compound and grow from the time those members are active all the way until those members retire, so that we can have a lot more than just the contributions that we started with. That's called pre-funding the benefit, or funding the benefit if you don't want to use the word pre, funding the benefit ahead of time. And that allows for us to save a lot of money over time by taking advantage of investments. So you can see on this page, we divided out, I think this is for CalPERS looking at the last few years. On average, if you're looking at how pension benefits are funded in total, CalPERS does a calculation every year, and they say, all right, out of the benefit payments going out, we have 11 to 13% of that coming from employees. They give an exact number, but we're doing an average because we looked at it over multiple years. We have about 29 to 32% of that coming directly from employer contributions. And then the rest is coming from investment earnings that we generated over time. And that's between 55 to 60%. So you can see the strong majority of the money that's being paid out actually is from that which is generated from investments. It's not just from contributions. So investments plays a very large role in making sure we have all the money needed to fund these promised benefits. And you can see here on the page, we discuss the normal cost. Normal cost is usually covered between employees and employers. And then we've discussed the UAL, that stands for unfunded accrued liability, or you might also see unfunded actuarial accrued liability. And that's unfunded liability that we have to make payments to catch up on. That's generally done by the employer. I can describe that a little bit more in the next couple slides coming up. So I'm going to leave it for that. Let's see if I can get this to turn. There we go. All right, so an actuarial valuation usually has maybe between, I'd say 50 and 100 pages. They gave me one slide to cover the actuarial valuations. So we have a lot in this one slide, but I actually like this slide. It covers a lot very succinctly. So when I'm talking about the actuarial valuation, I like to think of it as similar to a GPS. Say you're driving in your car and think you're in your car, you're going to a destination, you put stuff in the GPS. What does the GPS do for you? Well, it tells you basically two things. The first thing it tells you is where on the map you are and where on the map you are in relation to your final destination. So you see that on the GPS, you see how long till you get to that destination. And the actuarial valuation does exactly that through the funded status. You look at your funded status, maybe you're 80% funded today. You're working to fund all of the benefits that have been allocated, the costs that have been allocated to past service. You want to be 100% funded, so you know where you are in relation to that goal of getting to 100% funded. So the actuarial valuation does that for you. And then secondly, what does the GPS do? In 1 mile, turn left. And 2 miles, turn right. It tells you, it gives you the next direction on how to get to that final destination. And the actuarial valuation does that for you too. It basically sets contribution rates for the employers and for the employees where appropriate every year in the valuation process. So that's really the two primary things that the valuation does: contribution requirements and funded status. And then you can see on this list on the right, there are other outputs as well, kind of what I would call secondary outputs. It looks at what's happened between last year and this year for the plan. So it does analysis of demographic and economic experience. It provides a basis for risk assessment to see where the plan's going and understand what the risk factors are for it. It gives us a basis for disclosure requirements, including on the GASB side, the Governmental Accounting Standards Board side of things. And then finally, we don't see as much of this nowadays, but if there's ever what we call a plan amendment, there's going to be a change to the benefits of the plan. Well, the valuation is the foundation, is the basis for that plan amendment. So these are all things that the valuation is used for. Now, then the question is, we understand what the valuation is for. What do we need to conduct an actuarial valuation? And that's what we have here on the left. We need the membership data. We need to understand who the members are, what their demographics are, when they might retire, etc. We need financial data. Just think of that very simply as plan assets, how well we've done towards the funding of the plan so far. We need plan provisions. We need to understand what exactly has been promised the member in retirement, depending on whether they're retired or whether they're disabled, whether they passed away and have beneficiaries, etc. I need to know all of those plan provisions. And then the last two here is where actuaries really get involved. We need to understand the funding policies. That's saying, all right, we have these really volatile assets. How do we handle those assets when we feed them through the valuation? And then we have an unfunded liability. How do we amortize that? How do we pay it off over time? So funding policies really determine how we set contribution rates at their core. And actuarial assumptions, the last one here, is really how do we value the liabilities? When do we expect when people are going to retire? How long do we expect them to live in retirement and receive a benefit, etc. So all of these on the left here correspond to going into the valuation input such that we can produce this actuarial valuation. All right, I just condensed a 50 to 100 page report into that one slide. Hopefully that was good enough. And I should also mention I do a 4-hour trustee education every year. Can you imagine that, spending 4 hours on actuarial concepts with an actuary? They invite me back every year. I don't know, they're a glutton for punishment. But in that 4-hour presentation, we do spend a lot of time talking about how we get from determining benefits and what benefits are needed to setting contribution rates for the employer. And so I've just taken, that thing is over 100 slides long. I've taken 4 of those slides here. And the sole purpose is starting with the valuation inputs. In fact, if I still have, if I have this slide here, the valuation inputs, we've got the member data, the financial data, the plan provision, starting with those guys. We're going to feed them into a calculation, and we're going to determine all of our anticipated members' benefits in the future. You can see here there's this word present value future benefits. So we're going to determine all of the benefits in the future. That's not only benefits they've already earned, that's benefits we think they're going to earn before they retire. So it's the whole sum of the benefits that we think they're going to have. We want to bring that back to present day So that's called discounting. We use a discount rate. I'm sure many of you in the audience are familiar with the discount rate. So we've determined this value in the future. We bring it back to the present day based on the discount rate. And then we have this concept, present value of future benefits. All the benefits we think our members are going to earn, both that they already have and that they're going to earn in the future. And that's what we've got to start with. This is the total set of well, put in quotes, liabilities, if you will, the total amount that we're going to pay our members. Now, we're going to move from this into determining exactly how contribution rates are set in the next 3 slides. So keep that in mind. We're going to do a bit of a transition. So we start with the whole pie. And now step 1 is, all right, we need to distinguish between what members have earned in the past and what we think they're going to earn in the future. And there's some nuances involved in that, but generally speaking, we use what's called an actuarial cost method. And we determine past liability, which is accrued liability, that which we've allocated to the past. And then that's which we think is going to be earned in the future. And that's the present value of future normal costs. So you can see the blue here in the pie is the accrued liability, and then the yellow is future normal costs. Again, in total, it's that red pie. It's the present value of future benefits. We just split it between the past and the future. All right, now the question is, well, what do we do with the past? What do we want to have happen to all that accrued liability? Well, we want to have assets on hand to fund the accrued liability. Everything that's allocated to the past, we want to have already funded. So we've covered that and we can just worry about the future. And so you can see here, I've now added a slice of the accrued liability, the blue part of the pie. That's now the value of assets. And unfortunately for this plan, the green, it should fully cover the blue, but it doesn't. Now, this is not to scale, it's not any particular plan, it's just an illustration, but you can see the green does not fully cover the liability. So what happens to the liability that's now not covered by assets? Well, it becomes the unfunded actuarial accrued liability, or UAL, as you can see here on the page. So now we split the liability, liability is all past service, but now we split it between what we have covered by assets, what we have funded, and what we don't have covered by assets, what is currently unfunded. And so you can see the arrow is indicating all of that is currently liability, but some is covered by assets and some is not. We have not touched the yellow, we have not touched the future normal costs. So now that we've gotten this far, we get to our final step in determining contributions. And that is, okay, we have an unfunded liability. We just talked about that. We want it covered by assets, but it's not. So what do? We need to start paying that off. We need to start adding assets to cover the unfunded liability. So we call that the amortization of the unfunded liability. I'm sure many of you in the audience have heard that term, an amortization. And so in each year for the next however many years that the unfunded liability is amortized, there's going to be an amortization payment towards paying off the unfunded liability. So you can see this, we have a dotted line in the pie on the blue. That's the amortization payment. That's the current year's payment to help pay off that unfunded liability. Now that's not all the contribution is made up of. We also have the next year's normal cost. Normal cost is your members earning their next year of service. So you can see in the yellow, we also have a slice, and that's the part of the present value of future normal cost. That is the very next year. So we have a slice of normal costs and we have a slice of unfunded liability. You put those together and you get the next year's payment. It's also worth pointing out here that the normal cost, as I mentioned before, is generally split between employers and employees. Each pay for part of that, but then the employer basically entirely pays for the unfunded liability. So the employer's contribution is part of the current year's normal cost and then all of the current year's amortization payment. And that's really, in a nutshell, in 4 slides, how we start with valuing benefits very abstractly and in general, and turning that into how we set a contribution and a contribution rate for your particular plan. All right, I'll take a breath here. And so now we just talked about normal cost and unfunded liability. We're gonna give an example to dig into the unfunded liability a bit more and how we pay it off over time. The first thing to point out here is really you can set up an amortization of the unfunded liability in different ways, different methodologies. There's really a lot. If you look across the United States, amortizations are done in a lot of different ways. But here in California, almost all our plans use what's called layered amortization. And that is viewed, especially in the actuarial community and at GFOA actually, that is viewed as best practice, layered amortization. And what's so good about layered amortization is whenever you have a new source of unfunded liability, it's identified individually, it's determined how long it needs to be paid off, it's determined what source it's from, and then you just methodically pay it off over time. A new unfunded liability piece comes in, and that's also identified individually and paid off methodically over time. So what you have is you have a methodology that provides accountability, because you can see exactly when unfunded, or sorry, it provides transparency is the word I'm looking for, because you can see exactly where unfunded liabilities come from, how long until it's going to be paid off, etc. And then it also provides accountability because each individual layer is precisely paid off over a given amount of time. So you really work through those amortization layers, and once they're paid off, they're eliminated and they go away. So you really have both transparency and accountability when it comes to layered amortization. Okay, so let's look at this example real quick, and we're going to build this over a few slides. So the first layer that we have here in this example, this is just a totally theoretical example, is an assumption change. Let's say the actuary says we can't have 6.8 anymore as a discount rate. God forbid we must go to 6.5% on the discount rate. Well, that increases the unfunded liability, and that layer has to be paid off over time. So you can see it laid out here on the slide. It's if we're using CalPERS, it's a level dollar payment, meaning it doesn't increase with time. It's the same dollar payment every year, just like a mortgage. We can say the size of the base for this particular employer is $5 million, and it's paid off over 20 years. You can see it all right here on the slide laid out very clearly. Now we're going to add more layers to this. So now what if the actuary turns around and says, we need to do a change in methodology. Something we're valuing isn't quite right, and we're gonna have to change our approach to something. And so the fix results in an increase in the unfunded liability. So you can see here on the slide that's listed as a method change, and it's in green. You can see we put in a ramp up and a ramp down to the method change. This is the way CalPERS used to do it. They no longer ramp up or ramp down method changes. It's just a straight line like you see on the amortization change. But it does give a good impression here, or a good idea of what's going on. If you were to use a ramp, that gives an employer more time to prepare for that ultimate contribution level that it hits in year 5. So you can see a $7 million base cost. We're going to amortize that in this case over 15 years. And that ramps up over 5 years till you get to the ultimate cost, and then it ramps down at the end. So again, just for illustration purposes only, we've added this. And now the question is, all right, what else can happen to our plan? We already have a lot of unfunded liability and a lot of layers. Well, maybe there was an investment loss. This is on the experience side of the plan. Between last year and this year, we assumed 6.8% discount rate. We earned 0% on investment returns, so we were down 6.8% from what we assumed. Well, we've got to build that into our amortization. So here's a picture of an investment loss. Now, CalPERS really does exactly what we have on this page for the ramp. It ramps up investment loss, and it doesn't ramp it down. It just lets it fall off on the end. And the reason why it still ramps investments are the only thing I believe at CalPERS that is still ramped up. That's because investments are very volatile. So they can really shift employer costs over time. And so that is managed by ramping this up over time. A lot of other plans in California use what's called asset smoothing. It produces the same idea. It allows the asset experience to filter in over about a 5-year period of time. Very, very similar to the ramp up that you see here. And so now you've got it. We've just, for illustration purposes, we put this term at 10 years. We're amortizing the investment loss over 10 years. That is not what CalPERS does. They do 20 years. But you can see how that ramps up and fills in. And then I should have mentioned we have this net UAL payment. That's the net result of all the different layers. So that's the actual payment that's going to be made in a particular year. And you can see that even more clearly on this next slide. I should mention this is impossible. Now we're assuming we have an investment loss and an investment gain in the same year. That would never actually happen in reality, but for illustration purposes, here we put in an investment gain. You can see that's below 0. So that's actually a credit to the contributions instead of what we'd call a charge to the contributions, because it's a credit to the plan. It reduces the total unfunded liability with that investment gain. That's the dark orange here. put the same ramp up with the same 10-year period, so you can see almost that mirror image to the investment loss. And now that red dashed line that you see is a net result of all of these things. So the gain actually pulls down the cost from where it would have been just based on all of the investment loss, the assumption change, and the method change, those things that created a loss for the plan. So again, this is totally hypothetical, but it does illustrate the transparency that you get with layered amortization. You can see exactly what's going on with the plan based on particular sources of unfunded liability or even gains to the plan, like we have with this last one, the investment gain. You can see exactly how long till they roll off until that payment goes away. So if you're associated with the plan, I highly recommend, or I should say if you're associated with an employer that participates in a plan is a better way to put it, I highly recommend being very familiar with your layered amortization schedule, because that helps you know exactly what to expect based on current information for the plan that you're participating in. All right, moving into the last piece of my presentation for today. So I often get asked, basically, so you work on a lot of pension systems, you're at S&P, you looked you evaluated pension systems across all 50 states. Why are costs higher today? And why do they seem to keep going up and up and up with no resolve to them? And so I boiled some of that down here in this slide, basically why we've gotten to where we are today, and some indication of where we're going in the future. So in this slide, we talk about, well, let's look back 20, 30, 40 years. In the late 1990s, even the 1980s, we had really strong investment return plus 10% on average. And we saw many plans get into surplus. That means over 100% funded. And we also saw quite a few plans get into what CalPERS calls super funded, which is more than surplus. It's not only that your accrued liability is funded by assets, your entire present value of future benefits, if you remember back to that red circle I had, is funded by assets. So even future costs are anticipated to be funded by assets. And some plans were in the super funded position. And so what this did is it led to contribution holidays. It made it look like pensions cost basically nothing. Right about the turn of the century, we had a lot of plans on contribution holidays. Employers did not have to contribute a thing towards the pension plan. And in some cases, employees also didn't have to contribute a thing because they were so well funded at the time. Well, that led to a lot of pressure to increase benefits and make them stronger. And that was done, as we know, at the right after the turn of the century. And so we saw benefit improvements, benefit enhancements, but not just for future employees and not just for future service of current employees. We also saw benefit enhancements for past service for current employees. So basically the best deal possible for current employees, that even their past service would also be enhanced. But the problem was, a year or two after this was passed, we had the dot-com bubble burst. And then not long after that, we had the global financial crisis. And so the conclusion here is the surplus that we were enjoying proved to be quite transient, but the retrospective benefit improvements proved to not be transient. They proved to be much more permanent in nature. And so you had a disconnect between the benefits and the enhanced benefits that were given and how we were funding those benefits over time. And so that's led to much of the higher costs that we see today. Very much so, I can say that with a straight face, much of the cost today. In addition to that, pension systems in California, especially, I'm going to hold out CalPERS to this. They've changed now, so they're on a much better track. But back in the day when these are happening, the old funding policies and the asset smoothing policies that CalPERS had were ineffective at dealing with unfunded liability. And that was fine because at that time they didn't have unfunded liability, but when things went south and we had unfunded liability, those policies in place did not effectively deal with the unfunded liability. They allowed the unfunded liability to grow. They allowed contributions to be less than they should have been at that time. Contributions grow, and that became part of our problem. And that is not unique to CalPERS. There are a lot of states in the United States that had insufficient contributions for a time, and that led to problems that led to growing and compounding costs over time. If you've heard the term 30-year rolling amortization, That's what CalPERS uses. It's like a 30-year mortgage, except not used in the past. It's like a 30-year mortgage, except after 1 year it's refinanced, and then after 1 year it's refinanced. So the mortgage never gets paid off in any way, shape, or form. And that was the policies in place in the time. In fact, I think I cover that more in the next slide. So let's go there. So that was then, right? We were looking at the then, what happened around the turn of the century. Now, what do we have in front of us? Well, we have a more challenging economic environment, so we're not expecting investments to earn as much as they were in the past. So assumptions have been changed and become more conservative. That includes the discount rate, which is the expected return on investments. It also includes what we call generational mortality. A lot of our plans now use generation mortality, which builds into the valuation that people are going to live a little bit longer each year, even the next year, and then the next year, and the next year. People are going to live a little bit and a little bit longer. And that's a true statement, but that wasn't built into the valuation 10, 15, 20 years ago. And so that realization that plans will get more expensive with time as people live longer is now fully baked into your actuarial valuation. So between the discount rate and the mortality changes, we've had significant assumption changes. In fact, I did a research paper with NIRS. NIRS is the National Institute on Retirement Security. That research paper basically looked at the experience of public pension plans from the Great Recession until today. And what we found is, I won't summarize the whole paper, we don't have time for it, but the key that I want to summarize here, you can see it on this chart on the slide, is we took 3 different plans. They're actually all plans in California, and we took their liability as of today, their current population, current assumptions, and we said, what if we use the exact same population, but we changed the assumptions to back what they were right before the global financial crisis? You can see the liability with the old assumptions are in green for these 3 plans. The liability with the new assumptions, exact same people, are in yellow for this plan. And generally, on average, we found that for most plans, there's about a 15 to 20% increase in liability based on assumption changes alone, but just assumptions becoming more conservative. That's important to understand, because if you have actually 2 out of the 3 of these plans, if you went back and used the assumptions before the global financial crisis, which we're not recommending, we don't think they would be appropriate anymore, but if you were to use them, 2 out of the 3 of our plans would be well over 100% funded today. So that gives you an idea of the headwinds we've been facing over time. Has to do with these assumption changes. And that may be obvious to some of us, but it's not obvious to all of us. And it's an important concept to wrap your head around, that we've been making changes to our pension systems that make them more conservative, that assess liability more realistically. It's a very important thing to be done, but it creates higher costs when it's being done. And so that's part of what we're dealing with right now. In addition to that, the last part of the slide is on the process side of things, the funding policy side of things. CalPERS really shaped up. I mentioned 10, 20 years ago, the contributions they were asking for were not effective with dealing with unfunded liability. They switched off of what we call 15-year asset smoothing, which really did a poor job of tracking what's going on in the assets. They could have just shortened it to 5 years, but they built in this direct rate smoothing over 5 years, which is quite similar. That's fine. They did the job to get away from 15 years, which was very helpful. And then on the amortization, like I said, they used to have 30-year rolling amortization where they'd refinance every year. They've shortened that down to 20 years, and now it's no longer rolling. It's layered amortization, like I said, is best practice, and it's level dollar. So you start paying some principal down even in year 1. And so those types of changes are very important from a CalPERS perspective, from a system perspective. They help make these pension systems much more sustainable and healthy over the long term, but they are painful in the short term. I should also say they make it much more affordable in the long term. If you're paying down unfunded liability, which is very expensive to hold on to, over the long term, the plan will get much more affordable. So that is good news to, even though it results in higher costs today. All right, so I'm running out of time here, but I'm going to do just a couple slides to further illustrate what I'm talking about on the assumption change category. First of all, this is a slide from NASRA. It's the National Association of State Retirement Administrators. And this it's kind of hard to grasp when you just first look at it. It's kind of just an interesting painting, if you will, but this has to do with the discount rate, the investment return assumption. And the first column here on the graph is 2001. You can see the median discount rate was right at 8%. And we had some plans above 8%, up to 8.5 and above. We had some plans down in the 7s, but not really any at 7 or below. And then as time goes on, that kind of plods along. And then you hit the global financial crisis. And then everyone starts to realize, wow, we're not in the same economic environment that we used to be in. And you see this big swoosh upwards on the graph. And that doesn't mean that discount rates are going up. It means that the higher discount rates are going away. They're getting off the graph. And so the median discount rate in 2023 has moved down a whole percent from 8% to 7%. We no longer have anyone in the 8s or aboves. And now we're starting to see a larger contingent in the 6s. And those 6s are growing. In fact, if you look at California, see if, all right, here on the next slide, here, this is a slide of where California discount rates are today. I gave you that introduction a while back that we have CalPERS, CalSTRS, and University of California. We have all these 20 county act systems, and we have some city systems. I've put a lot of those here on all in one spot just to take a look. You can see, if you look at this, as of last year, there are 2 new things that I could say as of last year. And the first one is that there are more plans in California whose discount rate starts with a 6 than whose discount rate starts with a 7. That just happened as of last year. So really a big change from what we saw in the NASRA graph from 10, 15, 20 years ago. The other thing here is that the highest plan in California, just as of last year, is 7.25, not a single plan higher than that. And there's only one plan at 7.25. So we've really seen a shift downwards in terms of discount rate. And again, lower discount rate means higher current costs. But it's important if it's a reality, if we're not expecting to get the investment returns in the future that we might have had in the past. It's very important to build that in up front. Otherwise, we're just going to see higher and higher costs as we get investment losses over time. All right, here's just a quick picture of CalPERS and what's happened with the CalPERS fund over time. We've got 2 basic things going on here. We've got a y-axis, which is the unfunded accrued liability. You can see that in billions. And then the x-axis is time, but we also have on the graph, we've indicated the funded ratio over time. And so again, what's really interesting here is you have the global financial crisis. So we see losses in 2010 and 11 and kind of 12, 13, 14, they're still kind of dealing with the losses of the global financial crisis. And you can see that on the funded ratio. But then it's interesting that unfunded liability continues to go up after we've dealt with the global financial crisis. And you ask why that is, and hopefully I made that clear in the last 2 slides. It is primarily due to assumption changes. At first, it was also due to ineffective methodologies to set contribution rates, but those have changed. They're now much more effective. But we've had significant changes to assumptions that make the plan liabilities be evaluated much more conservatively. And that's led to increased unfunded liability here. I don't think that's going to continue forever. So I do think there is a light at the end of the tunnel when it comes to those kind of liabilities as we pay off the liability associated with assumption changes. But those are the challenges that we've faced over the last 10 years. And they are quite painful. They're difficult challenges. So as a closeout here, this is a slide we put together with the help of NHA, where this is where you get information regarding your CalPERS plan. And I want to point out at the start of the slide is, so we've talked a lot about CalPERS. I've also tried to slide in there a little bit about the other plans, as we have a lot of other plans in California. Basically, all plans in California put the actuarial valuation reports online. They make them accessible for all the employers, all the members to go to see. So now that I've spent that 1 page in making you an expert on the actuarial valuation, you can go online and access those. CalPERS has them, but all the other agencies do too. And the other thing that I love here is the CalPERS Pension Outlook tool. This was created after I left CalPERS, but it's a really nifty projection where you can experiment. You can look at a lot of future states or possible states for your plan. So I do recommend looking at that as well. So with that, Mike, I'm going to turn it over to you. And thank you all for listening to the first part of this webinar.
Todd, just before you pass the baton here, we do have a question I'd like to ask. the UAL base layers, for CalPERS plans, are they all amortized over 20 years?
Oh, what a good question. I believe that's true, but I can answer that in the chat if you give me 5 minutes while Mike is talking. I can verify that. It's been a while since I've looked at that part of the amortization policy.
Robert, I could probably help with that. All the new bases are over 20 years. I think where you'll see distinctions is whether it's a ramp up or if it just starts at kind of a level payment. But when you look at all the different layers, you know, most agencies have dozens of layers because many were added years ago. So the remaining terms on those are much shorter than 20. But the new ones are mostly over 20 years.
Yeah, mostly is exactly right. I just pulled it up, and so Mike is exactly right. There are some unique circumstances where they might be different. One example is a golden handshake. If any of you are familiar with that, that's done over a much shorter period of time because that's basically for those who are going into retirement. So that's done over 5 years. There's a couple other nuances, but for the main layers, the gains and losses, the assumption changes, those are all done over 20 years.
All right, thank you.
Great. Well, thank you, Todd. Great work on that first part. And just good morning, everybody. Again, I'm Mike Meyer with NHA Advisors. As Robert mentioned in the beginning, a little bit of a different background than Todd. Not an actuary. NHA is a fiduciary municipal advisor to our public agency clients. So when we look at pensions, we are really looking at this as one piece of a big puzzle in terms of long-term fiscal sustainability and resiliency. So we'll definitely be deferring a lot of the technical actuarial questions to Todd if there are any later in the program. But we do know that public agencies have lots of different needs out there, and pensions is just one piece of the puzzle. Just to stay on this page quickly, as Todd mentioned, once a year, those actuarial reports are released. I know the new ones for CalPERS are now on the My CalPERS portal. In the last week or two, they were published there. Those will reflect the negative 7.5% returns from fiscal year 22. So you're going to see, most agencies are going to see a pretty big increase in the UAL and a large drop in the funding ratio, unfortunately. The bottom right there outlines what's called the Managing Employer Contribution Worksheets, or the MEC sheets. These have been around for quite a while, but they are only passed along to you if you request them from your actuary, but those will give you all the very detailed numbers for those amortization base layers that Todd mentioned earlier, as well as allow you to play with different cost management strategies, whether that's a fresh start or an ADP, and those are things we'll get into on the following slides. And then, as Todd mentioned, that new free pension outlook tool is amazing. Outputs to a very user-friendly Excel spreadsheet that you could sync up to your general fund forecast. And I think the most helpful part of it is that you can toggle with different variables, so you can play around with different investment return assumptions in the future if you want to conservatively budget and plan. You can look at different recessionary type variables or other assumption changes. So with the rest of today's webinar and really next week's webinar are going to focus on some of the common cost management strategies for this growing UAL challenge. Today we'll have a couple slides on each of these 6 listed here on slide 30, talk a little bit high level about what they are, the pros and the cons, and next week really get into some real world kind of technical analysis. And the case studies next week by those 3 agencies are going to highlight how all of these were used in a hybrid manner to manage rising pension costs. So just to quickly list them here, first one being prepaying the UAL early in the fiscal year. The second one is a new amortization structure, typically known as a fresh start, depending on your retirement plan. Thirdly, an additional discretionary payment, or ADP. Fourth, a Section 115 trust. Fifth, an internally held pension reserve. And sixth, a UAL restructuring through some sort of bond or loan. And so again, we'll dive right into these right away, have a couple slides on each one. The UAL prepayment strategy is something that most agencies do, most CalPERS agencies do. 80% of agencies across the state did this last fiscal year. We will have stats next week for this fiscal year 24 that July 31st just passed. But essentially, by paying the whole UAL up front by July 31st, you get a 3.24% discount. So instead of paying monthly, you pay it all up front if you do have the budget capacity to do so. Simple example, for a $12 million UAL payment for the year, you could pay $1 million each month, or you can prepay it and get a $400,000 discount. That would be about $11.6 million if paid early in the fiscal year. So one of the benefits of the prepayment is obviously the 3.24% discount. Many agencies within their pension funding policy also use this as a budgetary mechanism to really get more funds going towards a pension strategy. So a lot of agencies we've seen within their policies will really say that discount amount will continue to be dedicated towards pensions. Maybe it'll go into a 115, maybe an ADP or some other sort of strategy. The downside is obviously short-term liquidity is impacted, so you would only want to do the prepayment if it isn't detrimental to your other reserve levels. The other thing worth considering in today's environment is what else could be done with that money. So instead of sending, in our example, 11.6 million out the door, could that money be used elsewhere? And in the past, there really wasn't much opportunity to earn much on that money. A few years ago, I think most folks are earning 0 to under 0.2% on their reserves. But in today's environment, where you can pretty easily earn 3, 4, 5%, that actual benefit of doing the prepayment is a bit less. And so that's what we'll take a look at next week. Just look at really what the effective benefit is of doing the prepayment based on different market conditions and other opportunities that you have with those same reserves. The second strategy is what's known as a fresh start. CalPERS terms it a fresh start, but really it's asking your retirement plan for a new amortization schedule. And that new amortization schedule really means that all those amortization base layers of an entire plan, you have to do it for an entire plan, so perhaps all safety or all miscellaneous, get collapsed into one amortization base with level payments. The one requirement with CalPERS, and this used to not always be the case, it used to be the case that you could choose whatever term was most viable, which means you could extend the term. Now CalPERS requires a shorter final term. You have to demonstrate that the payments under the new fresh start are lower overall than the current UAL amortization. So there are usually a couple options shown in the CalPERS reports, but just know that there's lots of options out there, 10 all the way up to usually 15, 16, 17 year, so long as you can demonstrate that those payments are lower than the current schedule. Not a very common option. We don't have exact stats, but CalPERS did tell me they think there was less than 15 of these voluntary fresh starts over the last 1 to 2 years. There are some unique situations where fresh starts will happen automatically. Sometimes when you go overfunded, or when a plan closes, or some other unique circumstances as well. Some of the benefits of the fresh start is that because you are shortening the term, you're saving on interest costs in the out years. So you do have lower cumulative payments. You are accelerating the amortization of that UAL principal. And those payments are more predictable. They're level, as opposed to kind of having this fluctuating repayment shape that Todd described earlier. Most agencies are seeing something that's rising very quickly and then drops off in the future. So this is a little bit more predictable. For some agencies, one benefit is that these payments are now on autopilot. So those higher payments are fixed, meaning that maybe you don't have to go back to the decision makers each year to make higher discretionary contribution decisions. So that could be a benefit depending on your situation, and if you feel comfortable that you have the budget capacity to absorb those near-term higher payments. Downsides, of course, are that there are significantly higher payments, typically in the near term, the first 3, 4, 5 years. And then there is no flexibility to undo the fresh start and go back to the prior amortization. And for those reasons, that's why we don't see it as a one of the more popular options. There are other ways we'll get into to kind of pay extra. Next week, we'll take a look at some actual analysis for some different fresh start situations, and also why in today's environment, it may make sense for some agencies, especially agencies that may have issued bonds over the last few years. They're seeing a repayment shape that is even more volatile in the near term. A fresh start to get ahead of the new base that's being added could be something that may be more viable from a budget perspective. So we'll look at that as well next week. I think this is the third option. The additional discretionary payment, often known as an ADP, is where you would actually just send money to the retirement plan and pay off principal and interest and get credit for that and reduce the payments associated with that payoff. Very common strategy. Typically several hundred a year is what we hear from CalPERS. You can see the chart to the right is very interesting. You can see it's the last 6 or 7 years. Big spike in ADPs in 2021 and 22, directly attributable to the big spike in pension bond issuance. And so that blue colored bar there represents the amount of the ADPs that were due to pension obligation bonds. In our review, that's actually, this came from CalPERS, but that number is probably understated. Those blue bars should be quite a bit higher because there was close to $1 billion of UAL restructuring bonds that were not POBs. They were a different structure like a lease revenue bond. Some of the benefits of the ADP is that when you send money to the retirement plan, it is a direct reduction of the UAL, which means the funding ratio goes higher as well. And you're also eliminating future payments associated with that debt. Downsides, it does require money, which means you're taking money out of reserves or surplus to fund that, which means less for other priorities. This option, as well as the 115 trust, we are seeing as two of the more popular options. So in comparison to that 115 trust, a little bit less budgetary flexibility because you aren't keeping that money in, let's say, kind of a rainy day fund. That money is out the door and you cannot claw that back. Next week, we will go through some sample analysis. We will look at kind of taking the same amount of money and choosing different types of amortization basis to pay off, and really what the differences there are in terms of when you would get your savings, how that would impact the repayment shape, how much you can smooth that mountain peak by looking at choosing different types of bases to pay off. The next option, if the slide will go through on 37, is the Section 115 trust. Again, one of the more popular options out there. This is a separate trust that's managed by a third party. Once that money is in that trust, it's legally restricted to be used for pension and OPEB expenses, not subject to the government code. So it does open the door to more investment opportunities. And budgetary flexibility is one of the key benefits that we hear from a lot of agencies, because you can choose when and how you can use that money. So you may need that money in the next 5 to 10 years to help smooth out that mountain peak in payments. You may not need that money, so you can let that money grow over time, maybe invest it more aggressively, and then at some point in the future decide when to send it to your retirement plan. And then also, if you do need that money in the short term, there are ways to get that money out, typically depending on your provider, if you need to reimburse yourself for pension expenses already made if there was an emergency cash flow crunch. So again, benefits here versus keeping them in the general fund. Typically, if you look at historical earnings, usually the ability to earn more on that money than keeping them in reserves. And then again, versus the ADP, a little bit more budgetary flexibility because you can choose when and how to use that money. Of course, you can always make an ADP from the 115 trust. So just to kind of reiterate something I mentioned before, these strategies are not mutually exclusive. There are synergies to using many of these strategies as part of a hybrid approach. Downsides: does not directly reduce the UAL. Similar to the ADP, it does require funds, so reserves or surplus. It does perhaps take away from other priorities you might have. Just like the ADP, you are giving money to someone to invest, so there is investment risk there. And then from what we've seen, I would say the vast majority of public agencies are using the 115 in more of a near to midterm manner. So typically those investments have a shorter time horizon for when the withdrawals may happen, meaning that there is a potential for lower returns than CalPERS just because it's invested a little bit less aggressively for the most part. Not for all agencies, but big picture, most agencies are in something more moderate or conservative. So next week, what we'll do is we'll look at some analysis of how agencies are using this trust to smooth the impending mountain peak in payments. We'll also talk about some of the popular players in the 115 space and different considerations when choosing the right provider for your agency, because they are all a little bit different. The next option is an internally held pension reserve. So very similar to the 115 trust in that it can be used as a shock absorber to really stabilize future volatility, but it is maintained under your control. So still subject to the government code, so very limited with the investments, but many agencies have an internal reserve kind of paired with a lot of these other strategies. So many agencies use this as kind of a first line of defense to funnel in money throughout the fiscal year. And at some point later on, once those funds are built to higher levels, perhaps redeploy that money, to the 115 or to ADPs. Some agencies actually prefer this type of reserves if the restrictions of a 115 aren't desirable. So again, another option that's similar to the 115. In today's market environment, many agencies are seeing the ability to actually increase investment earnings on their internally held pension reserves. So again, benefits include enhanced budgetary flexibility. Both a pro and a con of this option is that these funds can get easily repurposed, more easily repurposed to other needs than a 115 trust. So that could be seen as a pro if you want to shift that money to something else, whether that's capital or to replenish operating reserves. That could also be seen as a con as well, given that it could be repurposed to something non-pension. Next week, again, we'll talk a little bit about when an internal reserve might make sense versus, let's say, a 115 trust, and we'll also look at some analysis on how that can be used to smooth the peak in payments that's coming. So the last a few slides before we open it up to Q&A, the last option, which was a very popular option up until about 15 months ago, is a UAL restructuring or a pension bond. And this is where an agency would issue a bond or a loan and use the proceeds to pay off all or a portion of the UAL. And so most agencies typically looked at this option or evaluated if there's a lower interest rate to be had on that debt, much lower than the discount rate charged by the retirement plan, and also to reshape those payments in a way that's maybe more tailored and more desirable for your situation. So typically a more level payment, something that gives you a little bit more resiliency to absorb future fluctuations. Given the market conditions, by that I mean low interest rates as well as investor comfort to buy these pension bonds, we did see about 100 pension bond issuances from about May 2020 till about July of 22. That's about 7.6 billion of bonds issued. Most of the rates that were obtained were between 2.5 and 4.5. In 2020, the spring rates were around that 4 to high 3s. There was a big rally in the market, so many agencies were under 3% if they issued in early 2021. And then, of course, as folks know, interest rates rose pretty quickly, and then by the summer of 22, rates really shot up to above 5%, and we saw this strategy really move away, just given that the risk reward calculus was not in the favor of a public agency who might issue. The pie charts to the right show the breakdown of the types of issuances. So for the most part, nearly 80% were pension obligation bonds, about 12% were lease revenue bonds, and 10% were some other form of revenue bond. Nearly 2/3 were issued through a public offering to investors, but we did see quite a bit, 37% privately placed with a bank. Those were a lot of the smaller issuances, as well as a lot of the non-POB structures, given that most banks out there aren't comfortable with the traditional pension obligation bond structure, but would be possibly more comfortable with a lease or another type of structure. Potential benefits, obviously highly dependent on market conditions. We'll talk a lot about that next week, but the potential for present value and cash flow savings, also the ability to create a more sustainable shape that's tailored to your budget situation, as well as what sort of resiliency you may need in the future to absorb different economic shocks. As we'll talking about in a second, there is a lot of risk with a pension bond. The savings are not guaranteed. That said, given the way that CalPERS and a lot of retirement plans works, some of the savings, or nearly all the savings in the first couple of years, is guaranteed. So it does provide a mechanism to deploy more funds to other strategies, whether that be ADPs or a 115 trust. The downside of a pension bond, again, is that savings is not guaranteed. It is wholly dependent on the future investment returns of the retirement plan. So that brings up a lot of reinvestment and market timing risk. You are giving the retirement plan a big lump sum of money at one time. So especially in the early years after issuance, there's also more volatility. So gains are even more magnified and losses are even more magnified as well. So we have had a lot of volatility over the last couple of years. So for a lot of those pension bond issuers, if they took part in some of that 2021, 21.3% earnings year for CalPERS, those gains just got magnified even more. And then depending on how long in the year of fiscal year 22 that money was with CalPERS, you may have seen losses that were even more magnified. So because of this, it's very important to analyze risk. There's lots of ways to model out the downside potential of doing a pension bond, making more conservative assumptions with perhaps lower investment returns than the retirement plan is assuming, looking at different recessionary scenarios, and just looking at what are the cash flows if you were to do a bond and if you did not do a bond. And there's lots of components to the structuring in terms of the size, the structure, the term, things like that. And we'll talk about that next week and really how to analyze that risk so you can make a decision on this type of strategy if that's something you were to evaluate in the future. Last slide before we open it up to Q&A. Something we'll talk a bit more next week about is the importance of a pension funding policy. So just like many agencies have a suite of policies, reserve, operating reserve policies, perhaps CIP policies, investments, cybersecurity, whatever it may be. This is a very common policy that agencies are adding to that suite. It's looked upon as a rating positive by the rating agencies. It definitely increases the financial management score by S&P, but really it's an internal roadmap to how you're going to manage pension costs over the long term. And if you look at pension funding policies for agencies across the state, they're all a bit different, and that's one of the benefits is that it can be tailored to your own situation. I think next week when you hear the case studies from the different public agencies, that is, they will talk about how they develop their unique pension funding policies to really be adaptive to their financial but also political situation. Generally speaking, though, these policies really outline what the goals and objectives are, some of the tools that may get used, and putting some guardrails on those when and how they get used, but also looking at how the agency will generate funds to put towards this challenge. So often that's, how surplus funds will be treated, how one-time funds will be treated, salary savings, other things like that, and how that will trickle through kind of into the overall reserve policy of the public agency. And we just put this graphic up here just kind of to get the creative juices flowing, just to show how surplus funds can kind of flow through to top off all the different reserves of an agency, and then perhaps if there's anything extra, go towards things like pension or a 115 trust. Some agencies who issue bonds have a specific reserve that will be used to pay down those bonds early. Of course, what's not shown here are all the other priorities that an agency might have, perhaps capital reserves and things like that. So again, we'll talk a little bit more about this next week, give some ideas to the participants as to what you can consider including. And I think all three of the case studies are going to touch upon how they built their pension funding policy as well. So with that, I think we've left, Robert, about 10 minutes for Q&A. So I will hand it over to you. Sure.
Not a lot of questions have come in, but we do have one here that I wonder if it might be a little preview into next week. But Ken has asked about ADP, funding strategies. Are they generally layered in over time, Mike?
So they can be layered in over time. I think it's all predicated on whether you'll have the future resources to do so, right? I think in the here and now, if you have funds, folks look at what's the best use of that money. If you really need liquidity and that shock absorber, the rainy day fund, a lot of agencies are looking towards the 115 trust. But if you have sufficient liquidity, often just paying that directly to the retirement plan is a great option. Again, there's lots of places you can send that money for the ADP, and so you want to be cognizant of which plan, which layer you're going to get the most bang for your buck. But yes, a lot of agencies through policy will set up a plan to try to do those each year, but obviously very dependent on how operations are going and whether you will actually have the extra funds to do that. So Todd, I don't know if you want to, I know you've had a lot of experience with that as well. So
yeah, Mike, I was just going to mention, if you come next week when we have the case studies, we have some great case studies that are worth listening to. And in one of the case studies, I won't steal their thunder, but it's the OCFA, Orange County Fire Authority. And they basically did that. They set up a particular strategy. They called it a snowball strategy. And they set up, we're going to do payments over time. And as that reduces our unfunded liability and makes the contribution rate go down, we're going to take that savings and do additional payments. And so we're going to work on this and very purposefully make additional payments over time to pay off that unfunded liability as like a comprehensive strategy. So you can hear more about that next week as well. I think it's very interesting.
Another question, Todd, Mike, came in from Todd. Can I simply budget to add additional funds to our unfunded payment? For instance, add $40,000 to a $130,000 payment.
That's essentially what an ADP is. It's saying I have my actuarially determined contribution, I have that amount and that's set and I'm going to meet that. And then, I want to pay extra on top of that. I want to make an additional discretionary payment, an ADP towards that. And so that's exactly the definition. And then, as Mike was saying before, you're going to choose whether you just want it to flow through as a contribution gain and be amortized over 20 years. You can choose to pay off a particular base, whether a base that has a long wind to it or one that's shorter. And so there's a lot of discussion around that I think we'll get into more next week as well. But yes, the short answer to the question is you can certainly, if you want to budget additional money and make an additional payment, that is available, and CalPERS is well set up to receive that and credit it to you.
Yeah, and I think just to add to what Todd said, I think that's making a discretionary decision each year to throw in that extra money. As I mentioned before, you can actually lock in that higher payment if you were to do a fresh start. And I think you'll hear that from another case study next week where, given the situation, they preferred to actually just lock that higher payment in through a fresh start. We do have lots of clients who won't actually go through to do the fresh start, but they will almost internally plan as if they did the fresh start. So you could almost think of it as a soft fresh start. And I think that's what the question is referring to, just kind of budgeting that extra amount each year, and then you would send that in through an ADP vehicle. But again, if you feel comfortable with that higher payment, you could always set that in stone and just budget for the full higher amount. And that's kind of on autopilot with your retirement plan.
Okay, Mike, Todd, Brian has a kind of a scenario question here he'd like to ask. Any advice on CalPERS UAL and the trend over the last 2 years? Year in June 2021, our agency was fully funded, and now the current CalPERS reports for year ending 2022 had a loss about 7%. But I think the June 2023 CalPERS return was a positive 7%. Does it seem that our agency will be back to fully funded?
Well, I could start, and then Mike, if you want to add anything, just first of all, keep in mind the expected return, the discount rate is 6.8%. So if CalPERS earns about 7%, they're earning exactly what is expected. In other words, you're not really going to have what we call an investment gain. You're not going to see a big jump in funded status for your plan. 2 years ago, we had a big gain because CalPERS earned over 20%. And so we saw a big jump for plans, and that's where you might have got the 100% funded. And then 1 year ago, we had a significant loss where it kind of just unwound that gain, if you will. And we saw plans back where we were before those last 2 years it started. So the interesting thing about CalPERS is most plans in California use what's called the actuarial value of assets, and that smooths market volatility. And so you have a much smoother ride in terms of funded status and in terms of where you are based on asset experience. CalPERS doesn't do that anymore. They just say, let's see what happens in the market, and we'll give you your funded status based on that. So the funded status is going to jump around a lot more with CalPERS. And then they end up smoothing the contribution rate itself. They're still smoothing, but it's just on the rate, not on the assets. So that's an interesting distinction at CalPERS. And you're feeling some of that volatility in the funded status. But to answer the specific question of this year, you're not really getting any particular help this year from investment returns, but you're not really having any major pain either. It's kind of a neutral year. And so you're going to just continue to plod along funding that unfunded liability through contributions.
So Olga has a question here, Mike, Todd. If the agency pays off their plan, the UAL, with extra funds, and if PERS then has significant investment losses, we incur UAL again, even though we paid it off. How would ADP benefit, benefit them? ADP benefit them, excuse me.
I have my answer. Shall I go, Mike?
Go for it.
Yeah, so this is a very interesting question, and even more, it's also related to the consideration of issuing pension obligation bonds, right? Because you issue a pension obligation bonds, it essentially becomes a large discretionary payment into the plan, where you might partially or fully fund your plan up to 100% funded. And I always, whenever we talk about pension obligation bonds, I start with warnings. There's a whole bunch of risks that are often not talked about. I'm sure NHA does a good job of talking about it, but elsewhere they're not often talked about with pension obligation bonds. And one is that not only if you have an investment loss will your assets go down and you'll become underfunded again, you'll actually lose more than you would have if you had not issued the pension obligation bond in the first place. You have more assets in the plan. So if there's a loss of 10%, you do the math, you're actually going to lose more money. You would also gain more money if you had an investment gain. So the bottom line is if you do an additional payment so that you have more assets, you're going to feel what happens in the market more. You're going to feel the ups and they'll feel even better, and you're going to feel the downs and they're going to feel even worse. So you can't get away from that with an additional payment. But the other side of this whole discussion is holding on to unfunded liability is very expensive. CalPERS is using a discount rate of 6.8%, you basically have a loan with CalPERS where you're paying them 6.8% interest. And that's very expensive over time. And in fact, the most expensive plans in the nations are those who have the largest unfunded liability. They just must pay the most to deal with all of that interest on the unfunded liability. So anything you can do to get rid of that unfunded liability as quickly as possible will make you deal with much less of the pain over time for that unfunded liability. It's important to understand the point that you made, that it will come with some volatility in terms of how you feel future investments.
Okay, we're at the bottom of the hour. That'll close our session for today. We'll be back again next Thursday at 10 a.m. with our next session, Pension Management Strategies Applied, including more detail about the strategies discussed today, establishing pension management policies, and then as Todd and Mike both mentioned, some really interesting case studies on how strategies were applied in 3 very different agencies facing different circumstances. Mike and Todd will be back next week, but thank you both very much for a terrific session today. A lot of work went into this, really appreciate it. Finally, we'd like to get your feedback about the program. We will send out a short survey after the program concludes. Please just spend a few minutes giving us your feedback, give us your thoughts about the session. We really appreciate it. In fact, there will be some questions there about next session. If there's something that you would like us to address in Mike and Todd and our panelists in the next session, we'll put that in and try to answer those questions. So on behalf of Mike Meyer, Todd Towser, and all of us at CDIAC, thank you for joining us this morning and have a great day.
Thank you.